Exports of electric vehicles from China have been growing very rapidly and are going to continue to grow exponentially in the coming years. Many of these exports are going towards Europe. Many others, though, are going towards emerging markets, such as Southeast Asia. So this is going to become an increasing policy question that policymakers are going to have to confront in coming years. Hi, I'm Ilaria Mazzocco, Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and I'm here to talk about my recent brief, Electric Shock, Interpreting China's Electric Vehicle Export Boom, which I wrote with Gregor Sebastian from Merix. The big takeaway from the brief is that exports of electric vehicles from China have been growing very rapidly and are going to continue to grow exponentially in the coming years. Many of these exports are going towards Europe. Many others, though, are going towards emerging markets, such as Southeast Asia. So this is going to become an increasing policy question that policymakers are going to have to confront in coming years. Just recently, the president of the EU Commission announced an anti-subsidy investigation in EV exports from China into Europe. So I think that highlights the timeliness and the importance of the issue. I think it also is just a time in which there has been a lot of attention on China's exports of clean energy technologies and the importance of Chinese supply chains in this area. So we just thought it would be a very interesting area to explore, especially given that there's been a lot of recent data that shows some new and exciting trends in this area. I think there's a couple of different things that are important in the brief. One is that Western companies are actually major drivers of this trend. So Tesla, for example, is a big exporter of vehicles made in China towards the rest of the world, especially Europe. But there's a few other Western car makers that are doing the same thing. So that's one important trend and I think has big policy implications. Another one is that Chinese automakers are becoming increasingly competitive and are also internationalizing in terms of their production. So we do track a lot of new factories in Thailand, for example. So the brief relates to the broader policy area because it fits into the broader narrative of tech competition between the West and China. It also speaks to the dilemma that policymakers are facing when it comes to relying on China for clean tech supply chains, but also trying to diversify and also trying to protect their own industrial competitiveness. So I think it's a very important topic and one that we're going to be continuing to hear about in the coming years. I would say what's interesting about this is that it is a very new space. So just a year ago, the numbers looked quite different, but now the trends are becoming a bit clearer. And so I think it's just a new kind of topic. What's interesting about it is that it is still very much evolving and a lot of this data is very new and we are going to have to see exactly how it evolves in the future. To read the full brief, Electric Shock, Interpreting China's Electric Vehicle Export Boom, please visit csis.org.